They say rivers remember. They hold every body, every secret, every whisper of what was taken. In the year 1894, in a small town bound by superstition and silence, 37 children walked into the current of the Ashgrove River, and not a single ripple of them returned. What drove them there? And why did no one ever speak of it again? There are places in this world where silence grows thick as fog, where secrets seep into the very foundations of buildings and the roots of ancient trees. Ashgrove was such a place. Nestled deep within the mist-wrapped hills of New England, this mill town clung to the banks of its river like a desperate lover, drawing life from waters that ran dark and cold, even in the height of summer. The year was 1894, when Eliza Harrow first set foot on the weathered planks of Ashgrove's train platform. Her breath formed small clouds in the autumn air as she stepped down from the passenger car, her leather satchel clutched tightly in gloved hands. She was young then, barely 23, with the kind of determined idealism that comes from believing education can cure any darkness. How wrong she was. The town stretched before her like a daguerreotype left too long in shadow. Mill houses lined the muddy streets, their windows reflecting nothing but grey sky and greyer water. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, yet the air felt cold, lifeless. Even the river itself seemed wrong somehow, too quiet, too still for something that supposedly drove the great wheels of industry. Eliza had come to teach the children of Ashgrove, answering an advertisement that had appeared in the Boston Herald, seeking an educator willing to work in a remote but respectable community. The pay was generous, suspiciously so, but Eliza needed the position. What she found waiting for her would test every assumption she held about the innocence of childhood and the goodness of small-town life. Her first glimpse of the schoolhouse sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. It stood on a small hill overlooking the river, its bell tower reaching toward clouds that seemed permanently stained with soot and sorrow. The building was newer than most in the town, built perhaps 20 years prior, yet it carried a weight of age that pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. The townspeople she encountered on her walk through Ashgrove's muddy streets were polite enough, tipping their hats and offering subdued greetings, but their eyes, dear God, their eyes held depths of sadness that seemed to pull at something deep within her soul. Mothers clutched their children closer when strangers passed. Fathers spoke in hushed tones, their conversations dying the moment she drew near. Even the shopkeeper who sold her provisions seemed reluctant to meet her gaze, counting her change with fingers that trembled slightly. It was during her first evening in the boarding house that Eliza heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. Soft at first, barely audible above the creaking of old wood and the distant rumble of the mill wheel, it drifted through her window like smoke. Children's voices, singing in harmony so pure and haunting that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. The melody was unfamiliar, ancient-sounding, with words she couldn't quite make out. When she pressed her face to the glass and peered into the darkness, she saw small figures standing along the riverbank, their pale nightgowns ghostly in the moonlight. By morning she had almost convinced herself it was a dream. Almost. But when she mentioned it to Mrs. Whitmore, the boarding house proprietress, the older woman's face went white as fresh fallen snow. "Pay it no mind, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Children have such imaginations in these parts. The river, it calls to them sometimes, but they know better than to answer. They always have." The words sent ice through Eliza's veins. Something in the woman's tone suggested that not all children had known better. Not all of them had resisted whatever call drifted up from those dark waters. Have you ever felt it, that inexplicable pull toward something you know you should fear? Something that whispers promises you cannot understand but desperately want to believe. On her second day in Ashgrove, Eliza met her students for the first time. 37 children filed into the schoolhouse with footsteps so soft they barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the pale morning light. They arranged themselves at their desks with an orderliness that struck her as unnatural for children their age. No whispered conversations, no fidgeting or stolen glances. They simply sat, hands folded, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They were beautiful children, she had to admit. Their skin held a luminous quality, almost translucent in the grey light filtering through the schoolhouse windows. Their eyes were large and dark, filled with a knowledge that seemed far too ancient for such young faces. When she asked their names, they responded in voices soft as falling leaves, each name floating through the air like a prayer. Samuel, Mary, Thomas, Elizabeth, James, 37 names that would soon be burned into her memory like brands. But it was their behavior throughout that first day that truly unsettled her. They moved as one entity, turning their heads in unison when a bird called outside, reaching for their slates at precisely the same moment, even breathing in perfect synchronization. When she assigned them arithmetic problems, they solved them without consultation, yet arrived at identical answers. When she asked them to write compositions about their families, they all chose the same subject, the river. "The river knows our names," wrote little Samuel in his careful script. "It sings to us at night and tells us stories of the deep places where the light never goes. Soon it will call us home." That night, as darkness settled over Ashgrove like a burial shroud, Eliza would discover that some calls cannot be ignored, and some homes are not meant for the living. The third day brought with it a fog so thick it seemed to press against the schoolhouse windows like grasping fingers. Eliza arrived early, hoping to prepare her lessons in the quiet stillness of the empty classroom, but she found she was not alone. Samuel sat in the front row, his small hands folded precisely on his desk, his dark eyes fixed on the window that faced the river. "You're here early, Samuel," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. There was something about the boy that set her nerves on edge, though she couldn't name what it was. Perhaps it was the way he never seemed to blink, or how his smile never quite reached those ancient-looking eyes. "The river woke me," he replied without turning from the window. "It's getting louder now. Can you hear it, Miss Harrow?" Eliza paused in her preparations, straining her ears. Beyond the usual sounds of the waking town, the creak of mill wheels, the distant lowing of cattle, the murmur of early rising adults, she thought she detected something else. A sound like whispers, like wind through hollow bones, like water moving over stones worn smooth by countless years of patient erosion. "I hear the river flowing," she said carefully. "Is that what you mean?" Samuel finally turned to look at her, and his smile was both innocent and terrifying. "Not flowing, Miss Harrow. Calling. It knows we're ready now. We've been preparing for such a long time." Before Eliza could ask what he meant, the other children began to arrive. They entered in perfect single file, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the sound of water lapping against stone. Each child took their seat without a word, without a glance toward their teacher, their attention focused entirely on the windows that faced the river. As the morning progressed, Eliza noticed behaviors that chilled her to the bone. When she asked Mary to read aloud from their primer, the girl began, but her voice was soon joined by others. Not in the chaotic chorus typical of children showing off, but in perfect unison, 37 voices speaking as one. The words they spoke weren't from the primer at all, but something else entirely, a lilting musical language that seemed to flow like water over rocks. "Children," Eliza interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Please." Mary was reading alone. "The rest of you should follow along silently." The voices stopped as abruptly as they had begun. 37 pairs of eyes turned toward her, with expressions of mild confusion, as if they genuinely didn't understand why she had interrupted. Mary blinked slowly, then looked down at the book in her hands with surprise. "I don't remember what I was reading, Miss Harrow," the girl said in a voice barely above a whisper. "The words just seemed to flow out of me like water." During the arithmetic lesson, Eliza noticed something even more disturbing. She had written a series of problems on the blackboard, but when she turned to observe the children working, she found them all staring at young Thomas in the third row. The boy was moving his lips silently, his pencil dancing across his slate, and as he worked, the other children began to write, not copying exactly, but moving their pencils in identical motions, creating identical figures, as if they were all connected by invisible strings. When she collected their slates, every answer was not only correct but written in the exact same hand. 37 children had produced work that looked as if it had come from a single student. The implications made her hands tremble as she stacked the slates on her desk. What would you do if you discovered that the children in your care were no longer quiet children? When does guidance become complicity, and when does protection require defiance? At lunch, while the children sat in their unnaturally perfect rows sharing identical meals from identical pails, Eliza stepped outside for air. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and she could see the river more clearly now. Its surface was mirror still, reflecting the grey sky so perfectly it was impossible to tell where water ended and air began. Yet as she watched, she could swear she saw shapes moving beneath that glassy surface, pale, elongated forms that might have been fish or fallen branches or something else entirely. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her turn. Reverend Caldwell approached, his black coat billowing around his tall, gaunt frame like the wings of some massive crow. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and deep shadows, and his eyes held a weight of knowledge that seemed to press against her soul. "Miss Harrow," he said in a voice like grinding millstones, "I trust your first days among us have been educational." "The children are unusual," she said carefully. "They seem to share some kind of connection I've never observed before. Is this normal for Ashgrove?" The Reverend's laugh was devoid of any warmth. "Normal is a luxury we cannot afford in a place like this, my dear. The children of Ashgrove have always been special. They understand things that outsiders find difficult to accept." "What kinds of things?" His eyes shifted toward the river, and for a moment, his stern expression cracked, revealing something that might have been fear. "They understand sacrifice, Miss Harrow. They understand that some debts can only be paid in innocence. I suggest you focus on teaching them their letters and numbers, and leave their spiritual education to those who understand the deeper currents of this place." With that cryptic warning, he turned and walked away, leaving Eliza alone with her growing dread and the whisper of water that seemed to carry voices just beyond the edge of understanding. When she returned to the classroom, she found the children exactly as she had left them, sitting in perfect silence, their meals untouched, their eyes fixed on the windows. But now she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Condensation had formed on the glass where their breath had touched it, and in that moisture, small fingers had traced symbols and letters. The same message appeared on every window, written in 37 different hands, but with identical spacing and curves. "Soon we go home to the deep places where the light never goes." That evening, as Eliza walked back to her boarding house through streets thick with mist and secrets, she heard them again, those voices calling from the water. But this time she was certain of something that made her heart race with terror. One of those voices was her own. Sleep had become Eliza's enemy. Each night brought dreams of dark water and pale faces floating just beneath its surface, their mouths moving in silent songs that seemed to pull at something deep within her chest. She would wake with the taste of river water on her lips and the echo of children's laughter ringing in her ears, though whether the laughter came from her dreams or drifted through her window from the banks below, she could no longer say. It was on her 5th day in Ashgrove that Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She would follow the children after school. Something was drawing them to the river each evening, something that transformed 37 ordinary students into a single, unified entity that moved with purpose she didn't understand but increasingly feared. She dismissed class at the usual hour, watching from her window as the children filed out of the schoolhouse in their perfect line. But instead of dispersing toward their homes as normal children would, they gathered in the small grove of birch trees that stood between the school and the riverbank. Eliza waited until they had settled, then slipped out through the back door, moving carefully through the underbrush until she could observe them without being seen. What she witnessed there would haunt her for the rest of her days. The children had arranged themselves in 3 concentric circles around a depression in the earth that she hadn't noticed before, a hollow that seemed to have been worn smooth by countless small feet over many years. At the center of the innermost circle stood Samuel, his arms raised toward the darkening sky, his voice rising and falling in that strange flowing language she had heard in the classroom. The other children swayed as he spoke, their bodies moving like reeds in a gentle current, their voices joining him in harmonies that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath Eliza's feet. The words were incomprehensible to her, yet they stirred something primitive and terrifying in the depths of her mind, memories that weren't her own, knowledge that felt both ancient and forbidden. As the chanting continued, Eliza noticed changes beginning to manifest in the children themselves. Their skin took on a luminescent quality, as if lit from within by some pale fire. Their eyes reflected the dying light, like polished stones beneath still water. Most disturbing of all, their feet seemed to be sinking slowly into the soft earth, as if the ground itself was drawing them downward. The ritual, for that's what it clearly was, continued until full darkness fell. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The children broke their circles and began to move toward the river's edge, their steps now leaving no impression in the mud, their forms seeming to glide rather than walk. Eliza watched in growing horror as they waded into the shallows, the dark water accepting their small bodies without so much as a ripple. But they did not disappear beneath the surface. Instead, they stood waist-deep in the current, their pale faces turned upstream toward something Eliza could not see. Their lips moved in silent conversation, as if they were speaking with invisible companions hidden in the deeper waters beyond. Have you ever witnessed something so impossible, so fundamentally wrong that your mind refused to accept it? When reality becomes fluid, how do you anchor yourself to what you know to be true? Eliza must have made some sound. A gasp, perhaps, or the snap of a twig beneath her trembling feet. Because suddenly 37 heads turned in perfect unison toward her hiding place. In the darkness, their eyes glowed with the same pale light that seemed to emanate from their skin, and their smiles were both innocent and terrible. "Miss Harrow," Samuel's voice carried across the water with impossible clarity, "you can see us now. The river is pleased." Terror gave wings to her feet. Eliza fled through the woods, branches tearing at her dress, roots catching at her shoes, until she reached the safety of the boarding house. But even there, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, she could hear that haunting chorus drifting up from the water, calling her name with voices that sounded like wind through hollow reeds. The next morning brought no relief. When she arrived at the schoolhouse, she found the children already in their seats, dry and perfectly groomed, showing no signs of their nocturnal activities. Their behavior in class was exactly as it had been before, unnaturally synchronized, focused entirely on their mysterious connection to the river. But now there was an additional element that made Eliza's skin crawl. They watched her, not constantly, not obviously, but with a persistent attention that felt like cold fingers trailing down her spine. When she turned to write on the blackboard, she could feel their eyes following her every movement. When she walked between the rows of desks, she could hear their breathing adjust to match her pace. Most unnervingly, when she spoke, they would nod at moments when she hadn't asked questions, as if responding to words she hadn't spoken aloud. During the noon recess, Eliza made another discovery that sent ice through her veins. While organizing the children's readers, she found pages that had been altered, not torn or damaged, but changed. Words had been crossed out and replaced with others written in that same flowing script she had seen on the windows. The Lord's Prayer had become something else entirely, a supplication to the deep waters that remember all things. A simple poem about springtime had been transformed into a hymn of surrender to the ancient voices that call from beneath. Most disturbing of all was what had happened to the map of New England that hung on the classroom wall. Someone had drawn new rivers across its surface, waterways that didn't exist, all converging on Ash Grove. The Atlantic Ocean had been renamed the First Deep, and in the margins, small hands had written lists of names, hundreds of them, dating back decades. Names of children, she realized with growing horror. Names of the lost. That afternoon, Eliza attempted something that required every ounce of courage she possessed. She asked the children directly about their evening activities, about the rituals she had witnessed, about their connection to the river. The response was immediate and terrifying. 37 voices spoke as one, their words flowing together like streams converging into a single current. The river remembers when the town was dying, Miss Harrow. It remembers the bargain made in desperation, the price agreed upon in darkness. We are the payment willingly given, the sacrifice gladly made. Soon the debt will be settled, and we will take our place in the deep waters, where all debts are forgiven, and all secrets are kept. The temperature in the classroom seemed to drop 20 degrees. Frost began to form on the windows despite the mild autumn weather outside. And in that frost, those familiar words appeared again, traced by invisible fingers. Soon we go home. That night, Eliza would learn the true horror of Ash Grove's secret, not just what the children were becoming, but what the adults of the town had always known. The question that would torment her was not whether she could save the children, but whether they wanted to be saved at all. The basement of the Ash Grove Parish Church smelled of damp stone and decades of secrets. Eliza had slipped inside during the early morning hours when the building stood empty and the Reverend was away on his rounds. She had come seeking answers in the church records, driven by a desperation that gnawed at her like hunger. What she found in those moldering ledgers would shatter every assumption she held about the nature of good and evil. The record books stretched back over a century, their leather bindings cracked with age, their pages yellow and brittle as autumn leaves. But it was the pattern hidden within those fading entries that made Eliza's hands tremble as she turned each page. Every 50 years, like clockwork, the same tragedy repeated itself. Children would disappear from Ash Grove, not one or two, but dozens. Always the same number. Always 37. 1794, 37 souls called home by the Lord's mysterious providence, taken by the waters in the night. 1844. The river has claimed its own, as was foretold. 37 children went to glory, their sacrifice remembered in our hearts. And now, 1894. The 50th year had come again. But it was the entries between these mass disappearances that revealed the true horror of Ash Grove's secret. In the years following each vanishing, the parish records told a story of miraculous prosperity. Failed crops would flourish. Dying livestock would recover. The mill would operate without breakdown. Disease would pass over the town like the angel of death over the houses marked with lamb's blood in ancient Egypt. The children's disappearance wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction. Eliza found more detailed accounts in a journal hidden behind the official records, its pages filled with the cramped handwriting of Reverend Mordecai Thorne, Caldwell's predecessor. His words painted a picture of a community balanced on the knife's edge of survival, saved from extinction by an unholy bargain struck in desperation. The winter of 1793 brought such suffering as I pray never to witness again. The river froze solid, stopping the mills. Disease ravaged our livestock. Our children grew thin as scarecrows, their cries echoing through houses where hope had died. It was then that the elders came to me with knowledge passed down from the town's founders, knowledge of the thing that dwells in the deep places of the Ash Grove River. They called it by many names: the drowned god, the keeper of debts, the one who remembers. But its nature was always the same, an ancient entity that had claimed this river as its domain long before European feet ever touched these shores. The native tribes who once lived here understood the bargain. Every generation, they would offer their young to appease its hunger, and in return it would bless their harvests, heal their sick, and protect them from their enemies. When the colonists drove out the natives, they broke an ancient covenant. The river grew angry, its waters turned bitter, and misfortune fell upon all who drank from its depths. But the entity was not without mercy. It would accept a new arrangement, a new compact written in blood and sealed with innocence. How far would you go to save your community? When faced with the choice between the certain death of many and the sacrifice of a few, where does moral obligation end and survival instinct begin? Eliza's stomach churned as she read the Reverend's account of that first terrible bargain. The town's leaders had gathered on the banks of the river during the darkest night of winter, bringing with them 37 children volunteers, they claimed, though Eliza suspected the truth was far more complex. The children had walked into the icy waters singing hymns, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to please whatever ancient thing dwelt beneath the surface. The results were immediate and undeniable. The river thawed overnight despite the bitter cold. Fish returned to its waters in unprecedented numbers. The mill wheel began to turn again, powered by currents that defied the natural flow of water. Most miraculous of all, the sick began to recover, the dying returned from death's door, and the women of the town found themselves blessed with fertile wombs that would replace the lost children within a generation. But the entity's gift came with conditions. Every 50 years the debt would come due again. 37 children, offered willingly, their innocence preserved until the moment of surrender. And the terrible truth that made Eliza's vision blur with tears, the children would go gladly, their minds touched by the river's influence from the moment of their birth, prepared over years of subtle conditioning to accept their fate as a sacred duty. The journal's final entries were the most horrifying of all. I have watched the children of this generation grow, and I see the signs manifesting earlier each year. The river calls to them in dreams. Their eyes reflect its depths. They speak in languages older than human memory. By their final year, they are no longer entirely human. They are something between our world and the watery realm below. They do not fear death because they do not believe they will die. They believe they will be transformed, elevated, made eternal in the service of something beyond our understanding. God forgive us all. We have traded our souls for prosperity, our children's lives for our own survival, and the most damning truth, it works. The bargain holds, the town thrives. But at what cost? At what terrible cost? Eliza closed the journal with shaking hands, her mind reeling from the implications. Every adult in Ash Grove knew. They had to know. The parents who sent their children to her classroom each morning were counting down the days until those same children would walk into the river and never return. The Reverend who warned her against asking questions was protecting not the children but the town's most precious secret. She thought of Samuel's luminous skin, of Mary's glowing eyes, of the way all 37 children moved with the fluid grace of water itself. They were being transformed, prepared for a fate they had been conditioned to desire. And she had been brought here to witness it, perhaps to participate in it, maybe even to legitimize it with the blessing of education and civilization. The sound of footsteps on the church floor above made her freeze. Someone was coming. Eliza quickly returned the records to their hiding place and crept toward the basement stairs, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. But as she reached the bottom step, a voice drifted down from above. Samuel's voice, though he should have been at home with his family. She knows now, doesn't she? The river can taste her understanding of the wind. I'm pleased with her, you know. She'll make a fine witness to our going home. The response came in Reverend Caldwell's granite voice, and it chilled Eliza to the bone. The river has been patient with outsiders before, child, but patience has its limits. If Miss Harrow cannot accept her role in this sacred duty, she may find herself called to serve in other ways. The deep waters are always hungry, and they are not particular about age. The change came over the children like a tide. Eliza noticed it first in their eating habits, or rather their complete lack thereof. During lunch, 37 small hands would unwrap identical meals from identical pails, but the food would remain untouched, growing cold and stale, while the children sat in perfect silence, their attention focused entirely on the windows that faced the river. When she asked Samuel why he wasn't eating, his response sent ice through her veins. "We don't need earthly nourishment anymore, Miss Harrow. The river feeds us now. Can't you see how we glow?" And they did glow. It was subtle at first, a luminescence that might have been attributed to the pale autumn light filtering through the schoolhouse windows. But as the days passed, the radiance grew stronger, more pronounced, until their skin seemed to emit its own soft light, like moonbeams captured beneath translucent glass. Their hair took on the color of river foam, their eyes deepened to match the darkest waters, and when they moved, it was with the fluid grace of currents flowing over smooth stones. They spoke less and less, communicating instead through glances and gestures that seemed to carry entire conversations. When one child turned their head, all others would follow. When little Mary began to hum during arithmetic, 36 other voices joined in perfect harmony without instruction or hesitation. Most unnervingly, they had begun to breathe in unison, their chests rising and falling with the rhythm of waves lapping against shore. Eliza's attempts to engage them in normal classroom activities became increasingly futile. They would respond when directly addressed, but their answers came in that collective voice she had heard before, 37 throats, speaking as one, their words flowing together like streams converging into a river. And always their attention returned to the windows, to the dark waters that called to them with promises only they could hear. On the night of October 31st, All Hallows' Eve, though Eliza wouldn't understand the significance until much later, she was awakened by singing, not the distant chorus she had grown accustomed to, but voices directly beneath her window, so close she could feel their vibrations through the floorboards. She crept to the glass and peered down into the street. They were there, all of them. 37 children standing in perfect formation on the cobblestones below, their nightgowns and sleeping clothes glowing like captured starlight in the darkness. Their faces were turned upward toward her window, their expressions serene and terrible in their innocent acceptance of whatever was to come. If you knew that intervening would mean your own destruction, but staying silent would damn your soul forever, which would you choose? When does self-preservation become cowardice, and when does heroism become futility? Samuel stepped forward from the group, his young voice carrying impossible authority. "It's time, Miss Harrow. The river has been patient, but the debt must be paid. Will you bear witness to our going home? Will you tell our story to those who come after?" Eliza's throat constricted with terror and grief. These children, these beautiful damned children, were asking for her blessing as they walked to their deaths. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee Ashgrove, and never look back. But she knew she couldn't abandon them to face their fate alone. If she couldn't save them, she could at least honor their sacrifice by witnessing it. She dressed quickly and descended to the street, where the children waited with infinite patience. Up close, their transformation was even more pronounced. Their skin had taken on the translucent quality of deep water, their hair moved as if stirred by invisible currents, and their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect eternity itself. They were still children, but they were also something more, or perhaps something less. Without a word, they began to move. Not walking, exactly, but flowing through the streets of Ashgrove like a gentle stream finding its course. Their bare feet made no sound on the cobblestones, leaving no prints in the patches of mud and frost. They seemed to glide rather than step, their forms wavering slightly as if seen through water. As they processed through the town, Eliza saw lights appearing in windows, faces pressing against glass. The adults of Ashgrove were awake, watching, knowing what was happening, but powerless or unwilling to stop it. Some wept silently behind their pains. Others watched with expressions of grim acceptance. A few even nodded approvingly, as if witnessing the fulfillment of a sacred ritual. Mrs. Patterson stood in her doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as her daughter Elizabeth passed without acknowledgement. Mr. Whitmore pressed his fist to his mouth to stifle a sob as his twin boys, Thomas and Timothy, drifted by like pale ghosts. But none of them moved to intervene. None of them called out or tried to stop the procession. They had made their peace with this bargain long ago, accepting the price their prosperity demanded. The children reached the riverbank as the church bell began to toll at midnight. 12 deep, resonant notes echoed across the water, seeming to stir something in the depths below. The river's surface, which had been mirror-still, began to ripple with movement that came from beneath, rather than above. Shapes shifted in the darkness below, large, sinuous forms that might have been massive fish, or the coils of something far more ancient and terrible. Samuel turned to face Eliza one last time, his young face radiant with an inner light that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Thank you for teaching us, Miss Harrow. Thank you for helping us prepare for this moment. The river will remember your kindness." Then, without ceremony or hesitation, the children began to enter the water. One by one they waded into the current that should have been freezing but seemed to welcome them with warmth. The dark waters accepted their small bodies without resistance, supporting them as they moved deeper, until they stood arranged in the same 3 concentric circles Eliza had observed during their ritual in the grove. Their voices rose in that ancient flowing language, harmonies that seemed to vibrate through the very air and water around them. As they sang, the river began to glow with the same pale light that emanated from their skin, transforming the entire waterway into a ribbon of liquid starlight that stretched away into the darkness beyond. And then, as the final note of their song faded into silence, the children began to descend, not sinking, not drowning, but descending with purpose and grace, as if the water itself was drawing them down into its embrace. Their glowing forms grew dimmer as they went deeper, until they appeared as nothing more than points of light in the black depths, like stars reflected in a midnight sky. As the last trace of luminescence vanished beneath the surface, Eliza heard something that would haunt her dreams forever, the sound of children's laughter, echoing up from the depths filled with joy and terror in equal measure. And beneath that laughter, a voice ancient as stone, patient as eternity itself, whispered words that froze her soul. "The debt is paid for now." Morning came to Ashgrove as it always did, with the creak of mill wheels and the distant lowing of cattle, with smoke rising from chimneys and the murmur of voices preparing for another day's labor. But something fundamental had changed in the night. Something that seemed to infect the very air with a quality Eliza could only describe as wrongness. She had not slept after witnessing the children's descent into the river's depths. Instead, she had sat by her window, watching the water, which had returned to its normal dark surface, as if nothing extraordinary had ever occurred. No trace remained of the 37 souls who had walked singing into its embrace. No ripples marked their passing, no evidence suggested they had ever existed at all. When the church bell rang at 8 o'clock, Eliza forced herself to dress and walk to the schoolhouse. Her legs felt unsteady, her mind reeled with the impossibility of what she had witnessed, but some desperate part of her clung to the hope that it had all been an elaborate nightmare brought on by the stress of her new position. Perhaps she would arrive to find 37 children in their seats, ready for another day of lessons. The schoolhouse stood empty. 37 desks arranged in perfect rows, 37 slates, waiting for arithmetic problems, 37 readers bookmarked at the same page, but no children. The silence was deafening, pressing against her eardrums like the weight of deep water. Frost still clung to the windows despite the mild morning air, and in that frost, those familiar words appeared one last time. Eliza sank into her chair, finally allowing the tears to come. She wept for Samuel with his ancient eyes and innocent smile, for Mary who had hummed like flowing water, for all the children whose names she had barely learned before they were lost forever. But her grief was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the schoolhouse stairs. Parents began to arrive, not all at once, but in ones and twos, their faces carrying expressions of practiced grief that suggested they had worn them before. Mrs. Patterson entered first, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her movements careful and controlled. She approached Eliza's desk and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Harrow, I've come to collect Elizabeth's things, her slate, her reader. I'd like something to remember her by. Have you ever been surrounded by lies so complete, so universally accepted, that speaking truth becomes an act of madness? When reality itself becomes negotiable, how do you hold on to your sanity?" The casual nature of the request struck Eliza like a physical blow. "Mrs. Patterson," she managed to say, "Elizabeth, all the children. They're gone. They walked into the river last night. Didn't you see? Didn't you try to stop them?" The older woman's face never changed. She continued gathering her daughter's belongings as if Eliza hadn't spoken, tucking the small slate and worn reader into a cloth bag with movements that spoke of long practice. When she finally looked up, her eyes held depths of pain that seemed oceanic in their scope. "Elizabeth took ill in the night," she said in that same careful whisper. "Fever, most likely. She passed peacefully in her sleep. The Lord called her home, as he sometimes does with the young ones. We buried her this morning in the churchyard, beside her grandmother." "That's not true," Eliza said, rising from her chair. "I saw her. I saw all of them. They went into the water together, singing. You were watching from your window. I saw you crying." Mrs. Patterson's composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the agony beneath. "Miss Harrow, I think the stress of your new position may be affecting your health. Perhaps you should rest. See Dr. Henley about those visions you're having. Grief can play terrible tricks on the mind, make us see things that never were." Other parents arrived throughout the morning, each with the same rehearsed story: fever, accident, sudden illness, 37 different explanations for 37 children who had all supposedly died on the same night. They collected belongings with practiced efficiency, spoke of burial arrangements already completed, offered condolences to each other with the hollow formality of people reciting lines from a play they had performed many times before. Mr. Whitmore came for his twins' things, his hands shaking as he gathered their identical slates. "Consumption," he explained without being asked, "took them both to sleep. Peaceful," the doctor said. "No suffering." "Your sons were healthy yesterday," Eliza protested. "Thomas solved every arithmetic problem correctly. Timothy recited his letters perfectly. How can you stand there and lie about what happened to them?" The man's face went white, then red, then settled into an expression of dangerous calm. "Miss Harrow, I'll thank you not to speak of my dead children in such a manner. Thomas and Timothy were sick for weeks. Anyone in town can tell you that. If you're suggesting otherwise, you're either mad or malicious, and I don't know which would be worse." The most chilling visitor was Reverend Caldwell himself, who arrived as the last of the parents departed. His tall frame filled the schoolhouse doorway like a shadow, his granite features carved into an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Harrow," he said in his grinding voice, "I've come to discuss the unfortunate events of last night. The town has suffered a terrible tragedy, an outbreak of fever that claimed 37 of our youngest souls. It's a loss that will scar our community for generations to come." "Stop," Eliza said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Stop lying. I know what happened. I know about the bargain, about the river. about the thing that lives in the deep places. I found the records in your basement, Reverend. I read about the covenant your predecessors made. Those children didn't die of fever. They were sacrificed. Caldwell's expression never changed, but something cold and terrible stirred in his eyes. Miss Harrow, I'm afraid your isolation and the shock of losing so many students has affected your reason. The records you claim to have found, well, I'm sure you understand that grief can make us imagine all sorts of impossible things. Perhaps it would be best if you took some time to recover, away from Ash Grove. The school board has agreed to provide a generous severance package, enough to help you restart your career somewhere suitable to your temperament. You can't make me leave, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Someone needs to remember what really happened. Someone needs to tell the truth. The Reverend smiled then, and it was like watching winter settle over a grave. Miss Harrow, the truth is what we make it. The people of Ash Grove have made their choice about what they will remember and what they will forget. If you insist on clinging to these fantasies, you may find yourself facing accusations of madness, and mad people, well, they sometimes meet unfortunate ends. Rivers are dangerous places, especially for those who don't understand their true nature. That night, as Eliza packed her belongings by lamplight, she heard them again, children's voices calling her name from the water below. But this time, she was certain of something that made her blood run cold. They weren't calling for help, they were calling for her to join them. Despite Reverend Caldwell's threats and the town's unified conspiracy of silence, Eliza could not bring herself to leave Ash Grove. Something beyond mere stubbornness kept her rooted to this place of secrets and sorrow, a compulsion she didn't fully understand but couldn't resist. Perhaps it was guilt over her failure to save the children. Perhaps it was the scholar's need to understand the impossible. Or perhaps, as she was beginning to suspect, the river itself had begun to exert its influence over her mind. She moved from the boarding house to a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a place the landlord was eager to rent at below market rates. Only after she had settled in did she learn why the cottage had belonged to Reverend Mordecai Thorne, the predecessor whose journal she had discovered in the church basement. He had lived here alone during his final years, writing his observations about the river's influence and the town's dark covenant. He had also died here, found one morning floating face down in the Ash Grove River, with no explanation for how he had ended up in the water. The cottage stood less than 100 yards from the riverbank, close enough that she could hear the water's constant murmur through her windows, close enough that the sound invaded her dreams and colored her waking thoughts with liquid whispers. But it also contained something invaluable: Thorne's complete records, hidden throughout the building in ingenious concealed spaces that spoke to a man who knew his life depended on keeping certain knowledge secret. In a hollow space behind the fireplace, she found journals spanning 20 years of careful observation. Behind a loose floorboard in the kitchen, she discovered maps marking every place where children had vanished over the decades, not just in Ash Grove, but in settlements up and down the river valley. And in the walls themselves, written in cramped script between the wooden beams, she found Thorne's final conclusions about the true nature of the entity that dwelt in the Ash Grove River. The creature was old, older than human memory, older perhaps than humanity itself. It had existed in these waters since the last ice age, feeding on the life force of those who dared to settle along its banks. The native tribes had called it many names: Wendigo of the waters, the hungering deep, the one who drinks souls. But Thorne had given it a name that captured its essential nature more perfectly: the river's heart. It is not merely a predator, Thorne had written in his careful script. It is a force of nature as fundamental as gravity or magnetism, drawing sustenance from the very essence of life itself. The children are not consumed in the way we might understand consumption. They are absorbed, their individual consciousnesses becoming part of a vast collective entity that spans the entire river system. I have observed evidence of this absorption in my studies. The children who enter the water do not die. They are transformed, becoming extensions of the river's heart's consciousness while retaining fragments of their own identities. They exist now as part of something larger, something that remembers everything that has ever fallen into these waters, from the first native child offered in desperate supplication to yesterday's willing sacrifice. What is more terrifying, the thought that death is the end, or the possibility that consciousness continues in forms we cannot comprehend. When eternity becomes a prison, is oblivion a mercy? The implications of Thorne's research sent ice through Eliza's veins. If he was correct, then Samuel, Mary, and all the other children weren't truly dead. They existed still, their minds trapped within the collective consciousness of an ancient entity that used their memories, their personalities, their very souls as components in its vast alien intelligence. But Thorne's discoveries went deeper still. Hidden in a coded section of his final journal, she found evidence that the river's heart's influence extended far beyond the children it claimed directly. Anyone who lived near the water for extended periods began to show signs of subtle mental conditioning. They became more susceptible to suggestion, more willing to accept the unacceptable, more likely to prioritize the community's survival over individual moral qualms. The entire town of Ashgrove, in other words, had been slowly indoctrinated over generations into accepting their role in an ongoing atrocity. The parents who watched their children walk into the water weren't monsters, they were victims themselves, their minds gradually shaped by proximity to an intelligence that understood human psychology with the patience of geological time. And now, Eliza realized with growing horror, she was beginning to feel that same influence working on her own mind. The constant sound of the river had become soothing rather than ominous. The memory of the children's luminous transformation had taken on an almost beautiful quality in her recollections. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to understand the language they had spoken in their final song, not through study or translation, but through some deeper recognition that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. On her 7th night in the cottage, Eliza was awakened by voices calling her name, not the distant chorus she had grown accustomed to, but individual voices she recognized, Samuel's boyish tenor, Mary's sweet soprano, all 37 children speaking her name with the clarity of water over stone. She rose from her bed and walked to the window, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. They were there in the river, their pale forms visible just beneath the surface, their faces turned up toward her with expressions of infinite patience and terrible love. Their lips moved in unison, forming words that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her mind. "Come to us, Miss Harrow. Come and see the wonders of the deep places. Come and be part of something greater than the small sorrows of individual existence. The river's heart has been waiting for you, preparing a place of honor in its vast consciousness. You will still teach us, but now the lessons will span centuries, and the classroom will be all the waters of the world." Eliza felt her feet moving toward the door without conscious volition. The promise they offered was seductive beyond description, an end to loneliness, to uncertainty, to the crushing weight of moral responsibility. She would become part of something eternal, something that remembered everything and forgave all transgressions in the service of a larger purpose. But at the threshold of the cottage, she stopped. Some final fragment of resistance, some stubborn core of individuality, rebelled against the beautiful surrender they offered. She pressed her palms against the doorframe and forced herself to remember why she had come to Ashgrove, why she had dedicated her life to educating children, and why individual human dignity mattered more than collective peace. The voices in the water grew more insistent, taking on harmonics that vibrated through her bones and set her teeth on edge. The river's heart was not accustomed to having its invitations refused, and its patience, while vast, was not infinite. As Eliza stood trembling in her doorway, caught between salvation and damnation, she realized the terrible truth. Her choice was not whether to join the children in the water, but whether to do so willingly or be dragged beneath the surface by something that had grown tired of asking permission. The facade began to crack on the 9th day after the children's disappearance. Eliza had ventured into town for supplies, steeling herself for another encounter with Ashgrove's collective delusion, when she witnessed something that revealed the true cost of the bargain the town had struck with its ancient tormentor. She found Mrs. Patterson kneeling in the mud at the river's edge, her Sunday dress soaked and stained, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. The woman's hands clawed at the rocky bottom of the shallows, as if she could drag her daughter back from the depths, through sheer desperation, her voice rising in keen wails that seemed to echo across the water like the cries of some wounded animal. "Elizabeth," she sobbed, her voice raw with grief. "My baby, my sweet baby. I know you're down there. I know you can hear me. Please come back. Please forgive your mama for not fighting harder." Eliza approached carefully, her heart breaking at the sight of such naked anguish. This was the woman who had calmly collected her daughter's belongings just days before, who had spoken of fever and peaceful death with the practiced ease of long rehearsal. But here, alone with her grief and the water that had claimed her child, the terrible truth poured out of her like blood from a mortal wound. "Mrs. Patterson," Eliza said softly, kneeling beside the distraught woman, "let me help you. You'll catch your death in this cold water." The older woman looked up with eyes that held oceans of pain. "Death would be a mercy," she whispered. "Do you know what it's like to watch your only child walk away from you forever, to stand by and do nothing while she disappears into the dark? We tell ourselves it's for the greater good, that the town must survive. But at night I hear her calling for me." "Then why?" Eliza asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Why didn't you stop her? Why didn't any of the parents try to save their children?" Mrs. Patterson's laugh was bitter as the winter wind. "Stop her? Child, you don't understand the power of the thing that lives in these waters. It doesn't just take our babies, it makes us complicit in their taking. The conditioning starts when they're born, subtle influences that shape their minds and ours alike. By the time the final night comes, the children want to go. They've been made to want it, to see it as their sacred purpose." She pulled something from her pocket, a small cloth doll worn smooth by countless hours of loving play. "Elizabeth made this when she was 6, said it would protect her from bad dreams. But the bad dreams were coming from inside her own mind, planted there by that thing in the water. Every lullaby I sang to her, every story I told, every prayer we said together, it was all preparation for the night she would leave me forever. How do you fight an enemy that turns your own love into a weapon? When protection becomes preparation for sacrifice, where does parental duty end and complicity begin?" Over the following days, Eliza witnessed similar breakdowns throughout Ashgrove. The carefully maintained illusion of acceptance began to crumble as grief overwhelmed the psychological conditioning that had made the town's sacrifice possible. She found Mr. Whitmore drinking himself into oblivion at the tavern, muttering incoherently about his twins, while tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. She saw Mrs. Chen standing for hours at the schoolhouse windows, staring at the empty desks where her son had once sat, whispering apologies to the air. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery came when she encountered Samuel's mother, Rebecca Winters, at the town cemetery. The young woman, she couldn't have been more than 25, was tending a grave that bore no marker, pulling weeds and planting flowers around a simple mound of earth that couldn't possibly contain her son's body. "The Reverend says we need places to mourn," Rebecca explained when she noticed Eliza watching. "So we dig empty graves and pretend our children lie beneath the soil instead of wherever they really are. It helps some folks, I suppose. Give them somewhere to bring flowers, somewhere to say their prayers. But not you." Rebecca's hands still in their work, her fingers tangled in the stems of wildflowers that would wither and die long before the first frost. "I dream about him every night," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "He comes to me in the dreams, still my little boy, but changed. His skin glows like moonlight on water, and his eyes hold depths I can't fathom. He tells me about the wonders he's seen in the deep places, about the songs the river's heart teaches him, about how he's part of something vast and eternal now. That sounds almost beautiful, Eliza said carefully. It would be, Rebecca replied, if he didn't also tell me how much he misses the sun, how he longs to feel grass beneath his feet, how he sometimes remembers being warm and wants to cry, but can't because tears don't fall in the deep places. He's not dead, Miss Harrow. He's trapped. They're all trapped, and we put them there. The woman's revelation confirmed Eliza's worst fears about the true nature of the children's fate. They hadn't found peace or transcendence in their union with the river's heart. They had become prisoners in an aquatic hell, their individual consciousness preserved just enough to suffer while their bodies and souls served purposes beyond their understanding or control. That night, Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She gathered Reverend Thorne's hidden journals, his maps and observations, and his careful documentation of the river's heart's true nature. If the parents were beginning to crack under the weight of their guilt and grief, if the conditioning was weakening in the face of genuine loss, then perhaps there was still hope for rebellion. She began to visit the grieving families one by one, sharing what she had learned about their ancient oppressor, revealing the lies that had been used to justify their children's sacrifice. Some turned her away in fear. Others listened with growing horror as she explained how their prosperity had been purchased with innocence, how their acceptance had been manufactured through generations of subtle manipulation. But a few, just a few, listened with the desperate attention of people who had been drowning and suddenly glimpsed the possibility of air. Mrs. Patterson was the first to join her cause, followed by Rebecca Winters, then Mr. Whitmore, and 3 other families whose grief had burned away their conditioning, like acid eating through chains. "What can we do?" Mrs. Patterson asked during their first secret meeting in the cottage. "How do we fight something that's had centuries to perfect its control over us?" Eliza looked around the circle of grieving parents, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven her to become a teacher, the same love that had made them willing to sacrifice everything for their children's safety, even when that safety had proven to be an illusion. "We break the covenant," she said simply. "We find a way to sever the town's connection to the river's heart, and if we're very lucky, very brave and very determined, we find a way to bring our children home." But even as she spoke the words, Eliza could hear the water outside growing louder, more insistent, as if the river's heart had become aware of their rebellion and was preparing to remind them why no one had ever successfully challenged its authority before. The answer came to Eliza, in the depths of Reverend Thorne's most carefully hidden writings, concealed in a space so small and cleverly disguised that she almost missed it entirely. Behind the loose stone in the cottage's foundation, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, she found his final journal, the one he had been working on in the days before his mysterious death. Its pages revealed the desperate plan of a man who had spent 2 decades studying his enemy and had finally discovered its weakness. "The river's heart is ancient and powerful," Thorne had written in increasingly erratic handwriting, "but it is not invincible. Like all living things, it has needs, limitations, vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and courage. Its power flows from the covenant itself, the willing sacrifice of the innocent freely given by a community that believes in the necessity of the exchange. But what if that willingness could be withdrawn? What if the sacrifice could be refused not by individuals, but by the entire town acting in unity?" The Reverend had theorized that the river's heart's hold over Ashgrove depended on the collective acceptance of the bargain struck generations ago. The entity fed not just on the children's life force, but on the community's complicity in their sacrifice. It drew strength from guilt, from desperate rationalization, from the parents' willingness to trade their children's lives for their own survival. Break that cycle of acceptance, refuse the bargain en masse, and the covenant itself might shatter. But Thorne had also discovered something else, something that made Eliza's blood run cold as she read his fevered final entries. The river's heart did not give up its prizes easily. Any attempt to break the covenant would be met with escalating resistance, and if the entity felt truly threatened, it might choose to claim every soul in Ash Grove rather than lose its source of sustenance entirely. I have seen what happens to communities that try to escape their bargains with the old powers, he had written. Rivers rise without rain. Wells turn bitter. Children are born malformed or not at all. The very land itself rebels against those who break faith with its ancient guardians. But perhaps if one were willing to offer a different kind of sacrifice. The journal ended abruptly there. But Eliza thought she understood what the Reverend had been planning. He hadn't been trying to break the covenant. He had been attempting to renegotiate it, to offer himself as a permanent guardian or intermediary in place of the regular child sacrifices. His death in the river suggested that his attempt had failed, but it also provided a template for what might succeed where his efforts had fallen short. When facing an enemy that has had centuries to perfect its power, what price would you pay for even the slimmest chance of victory? Is it heroism or madness to risk everything for the possibility of justice? Eliza shared Thorne's discoveries with her growing band of rebel parents, watching their faces cycle through hope, fear, and grim determination as she explained what would be required. They would need to convince the entire town to reject the covenant simultaneously, not just the grieving families, but every adult in Ash Grove who had benefited from the children's sacrifice. They would need to stand united against an entity that could manipulate their minds, turn their neighbors against them, and bring down supernatural vengeance on anyone who dared to resist its will. "And if we fail?" Mrs. Patterson asked, though her voice suggested she was prepared to attempt the impossible regardless of the consequences. "If we fail," Eliza replied honestly, "the river's heart will likely kill us all, but our children will still be trapped in those dark waters, suffering for eternity, while the cycle continues with the next generation. At least this way, we have a chance to free them." They began their work slowly, carefully, approaching other families with evidence of the river's heart's deceptions and the true cost of Ash Grove's prosperity. Some doors slammed in their faces. Some former friends crossed streets to avoid them. But gradually, impossibly, their message began to spread. The conditioning that had made the town compliant for generations was weakening, eroded by grief and guilt, and the growing realization that their children's sacrifice had purchased nothing but the illusion of safety. Reverend Caldwell, sensing the growing rebellion, began to preach sermons about the dangers of questioning God's mysterious providence. The town council called emergency meetings to address dangerous rumors and seditious talk. But it was too late to rebuild the walls of ignorance that had kept Ash Grove's secret safe for so long. Too many parents had broken under the weight of their loss. Too many neighbors had heard the truth spoken aloud. Too many hearts had been opened to the possibility that their children's fate might not be permanent. The confrontation came on the night of the new moon, exactly 2 weeks after the children had entered the river. Eliza and nearly 40 adult residents of Ash Grove gathered on the bank where the sacrifice had taken place, carrying lanterns and torches that cast dancing shadows on the water's surface. The river seemed to sense their purpose, its current growing more agitated as they arranged themselves in a circle that mirrored the formation the children had taken in their final moments. Reverend Caldwell arrived with the remaining town council members and perhaps a dozen families who still clung to the old ways, but they were vastly outnumbered by those who had chosen rebellion. The Reverend's granite composure cracked as he surveyed the crowd, revealing the fear beneath his authoritarian facade. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice carrying across the water like a funeral bell. "The covenant has protected this town for over a century. Break it now, and you'll doom everyone you claim to be trying to save." "We already are damned," Rebecca Winters replied, stepping forward with Samuel's cloth bowl clutched in her hands. "We damned ourselves the night we let our children walk into that water, but it's not too late to choose a different path." Eliza opened Thorne's journal and began to read aloud the words the Reverend had prepared for his own confrontation with the river's heart, not a supplication or a new bargain, but a formal revocation of the covenant that had bound Ash Grove to its aquatic tormentor for generations. As she spoke, the water began to churn with increasing violence, and shapes moved in its depths, large sinuous forms that rose toward the surface with predatory intent. The river's heart was awakening, and it was not pleased. As Eliza's voice rose above the sound of churning water and her neighbor's frightened whispers, she felt the weight of ancient malevolence focusing on her, like the attention of some vast alien intelligence. The real battle was about to begin, and she was no longer certain that human courage would be enough to face what was rising from the depths below.